Fernandez from Ohio State University, from the Department of History. And Center for Latin American Studies invited me to come give a presentation today on immigration policies and how they might connect to your work as teachers, or what you see going on in the schools. And I want to start out first by saying very clearly that I don't want to advocate any particular policy in one way or another in any way, because immigration today and our policies surrounding immigration are so complicated, and I don't have an answer to how to solve some of these problems. It's much more complicated than I think we tend to understand, particularly in the way that we talk about it in public discourse and in the media. So my goal really is to try to inform you and teach people a little bit about the history of our immigration policies, and in particular I'm going to focus on the 20th century, and how that has shaped immigration from Latin America to the U.S. over the last century or so. So I'd like to start, make sure my technology is all set up here. So I'd like to start with this quote, which if any of you watch the news on MSNBC, you've seen Lawrence O'Donnell, who they're doing these different promos, and I just heard this one. And this past quarter, I teach a course on immigration history in the U.S., immigration and migration, domestic migration as well, along with Professors Judy Wu in History and Women's Studies, and Professor Lucy Murphy, who's leading the History Department at the Newark campus. And when I came across this in the middle of the quarter this spring, I thought, oh, this is perfect. I'm going to end our class with this, because we've been spending this quarter, 10 weeks, learning about immigration history. But I thought this was really significant and gets to the heart of what I think is so important about studying this past, and why it is that I study history, in fact. So I'm going to start us with a question for today. And the main one that I want us to think about, and what I'm hoping to show you. And that is, what have our immigration policies been over the 20th century, and how has this shaped Latin American immigration to the U.S.? We know today that the number of Latin American immigrants in the U.S. is growing dramatically. The Latino population, not only foreign-born, but U.S.-born Latinos have increased significantly over the last few decades. But what have the policies been towards immigrants coming from these countries, and how has that shaped who's here, who gets here, and so forth? So I'm going to give you an answer very upfront, and we're going to walk through this and see how this is the case. But what I would like you to consider is that U.S. immigration policies throughout the 20th century have made it harder, actually, for immigrants from Latin America to immigrate legally. At the same time that we demand such labor, and economic and political conditions in Latin America propel this migration. So this is a really important contradiction here that I'll talk about later on in the presentation. But essentially, we've restricted our borders. We've made legal immigration much more difficult throughout the 20th century, and yet people continue to come. And yet, in many ways, we need them to come because we depend upon their labor. So I want to start us with thinking about immigration historically and the way we talk about immigration in the past. And by and large, it's this Ellis Island immigration narrative, right? This is what we think of when you think of immigration. Europeans, by the 1880s, especially Southern and Eastern Europeans coming in through the port in New York City. And just to give you an idea of who we're talking about during this time period, this was considered a new wave of European immigrants, in contrast to Northern and Western European immigrants who had predominated in the 19th and 18th centuries. So before this, it was primarily British and Irish, Scottish, and other immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. By the turn of the century, we start getting more Southern and Eastern European immigrants. And we'll talk about what kinds of perceptions there were about them. But altogether, it's estimated that about 27 million people came into the U.S. between 1880 and 1930. And I remember hearing a statistic one time. that something like 40% of the population in the United States, of the white population in the United States, traces its ancestry to this wave of immigration during these decades. So a significant part of our population. Now, a quiz question for all of you. When immigrants arrived in the US before World War I, which document was required for them to enter legally? Was it A, a valid passport, B, a US work permit, C, a certified identification card, or D, none of the above?
D.
D, none of the above. That's absolutely right. When I tell students, they're not sure. But that's absolutely right. Before World War I, we actually had very, very open policies except for immigration from Asia. We restricted, actually Chinese immigrants were the first group that we restricted in 1882 and then Japanese in 1907. And there's a long history there that I won't go into, but apart from restricting Asian immigrants from coming into the United States, essentially if you showed up, you got in. So at Ellis Island, only 2% of immigrants were denied entry during this time.
And what would be a reason for that? Like illness? Or?
Yes, so there'd be these medical inspections, but reports say that they, on days when they were really busy, they lasted about 6 seconds. The inspector had 6 seconds to look at you, to see if you looked sick, if you had some kind of infectious disease. Apart from that, they would ask you questions about your political affiliations, if you were an anarchist, or especially during the Red Scare, if you were a communist or socialist. They would ask if you were a polygamist. A few other things, but there were these kind of social criteria that they would ask about. And of course, if you were one of those things, obviously you would want to say no, right? So you would But they would also ask if you had someone that would be able to support you if you had money and that sort of thing. So, but by and large, 98% of folks got through this fine. Now, the 2% that didn't get through, obviously it was very heart-wrenching to be denied once you got to the United States after having traveled, a month by ship from Europe to get here. Yeah. Yes. So they would have been dealing with an immigration official in their native language. So they'd have, Italian-speaking officials, German, Polish, etc. So only 2% of immigrants were denied entry. Just about everyone was legal, in other words. Okay, this is the big debate today, right? People say, oh, well, I don't mind immigration. What I'm really opposed to is illegal immigration. But we don't really think about what does that mean. And so that's what I really want to unpack today. And so our borders were fairly open. Today, when we talk about the immigration debate, a lot of people say that there's two sides, and those are the only options in this debate. Either you're for restriction or you want completely open borders. Well, I think that there's some middle ground in there, and if we want to think about our history and where we've come from, we have to keep in mind that actually the largest wave of immigrants that came into the U.S. came under very open borders. So I always like to have people think about contemporary immigration and contemporary immigrants in relation to those in the past, okay, the Ellis Island immigrants, as I'll call them. So some questions to consider here. Why did they come? They came for very similar reasons to people coming today, looking for economic opportunities, fleeing sometimes civil wars and political unrest, fleeing natural disasters. There's a great image, I don't think I have it here, but of Italian immigrants who were leaving an earthquake in Italy and coming to the U.S. because their homes had been ruined. Very similar to Honduran immigrants, for example, who started coming after Hurricane Mitch in 1998, I believe. Yes?
So, how does well, two things. So slavery had ended. So that labor force there was gone. So wasn't there a need also to fill that?
Yes.
Okay. So here's my second question. How did the word get out that, all right, we're going to start immigration?
Right. Well, there are a number of different factors that contributed to people starting to come during this time. One was, well, we have to keep this in mind, again, in thinking about contemporary dynamics and why people are coming today from Latin America. One was industrialization in Europe. As Europe started to industrialize in the late 1800s, thousands and thousands of people started getting displaced from their farms. So they can no longer support themselves. Tradesmen, craftsmen, people who worked, like blacksmiths and clockmakers and those kinds of, they were getting displaced from by mass production. We're now building things in factories, and it's, it's faster and it's easier, so they're getting out of work. So they start leaving Europe to come here because they're being displaced in the economic system. At the same time, here in the US, we're industrializing, right? And we need workers to build canals and railroads and to work in the factories and that sort of thing. And it's absolutely right that we see these large, one way to think about this history also is to think about it in terms of labor. We see these large changes in our labor system after the end of slavery in the 1860s, when that population continues to remain largely in the South, sharecropping and doing agricultural labor. The North starts to grow dramatically, and so that workforce starts to come from abroad. African Americans, of course, don't start migrating north until the early 1900s and World War II especially. So that's another interesting point here, is that as these folks are coming in, some African Americans are starting to come north as well, to Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, New York, those kinds of places. Yeah. So this is why. Those are some of the reasons why they're coming. Same reasons again. Immigrants come today. Who came? As you can tell from these pictures, a wide variety of people. Oftentimes it would be young men that came first, and this is true of most migrants, right? Usually they send the men. They go and look for work and get settled and established, and then they'll go back, or send for women and children. But you see women and children coming as well, which is a very important point, which I'll talk about in a second. How many? As I said, about 27 million, roughly, during this 4-decade period. And then here's the most interesting part. How did we receive them? Because in this Ellis Island immigration narrative, we've kind of had this amnesia about the way that we've treated immigrants historically. We think that those immigrants came and that they were good and we welcomed them, and there was Lady Liberty, receiving them. But in fact, our views about them were very varied, right? Today again, we look back at this and say, oh, well, immigrants have built this nation, et cetera, but the way that we talked about them then was very different. So think about the way that some of the negative things that we hear about immigration today, particularly Latin American immigration, right? Oh, that these people are taking our jobs, they're an economic burden on the country, they don't pay taxes, or they use our social services, they won't assimilate, they bring a foreign language and culture and customs, they're blamed for disease and crime, right? And the biggest one, of course, that is different compared to back then is the question of their legal status, right? Whether or not they're here legally. So I'll give you this quote to consider, which says, immigration to this country is making its greatest relative increase from races most alien to the body of the American people, and from the lowest and most illiterate classes among those races. They represent the rudest form of labor, reduce the rate of wages by ruinous competition. These are people whom it is very difficult to assimilate and who do not promise well for the standard of civilization from the United States. Now, you might think this might be something from Peter Brimlow, who's a very, very vocal anti-immigrant nativist, wrote a book in the 90s, I think, or someone else today, right, that might take a very strong anti-immigrant position. This is actually from the 1890s, and this is referring to Italians, Poles, Russians, and Hungarians. This is from one of our congressmen. And this was not an uncommon view during this time. I mentioned the fact that women and children came. There was an editorial, I guess, in a New York newspaper during this time that complained about the fact that so many women and children were coming in this, through Ellis Island in this immigration wave. And clearly, they were not going to be productive laborers here the way that men would be, right? So there was an objection to that, that this part of the population was going to be a burden on the nation. So, I want to pass some things out that might be useful to folks in thinking about some of these dynamics. One of the things, again, as I said, that we hear a lot about is the issue of whether or not people are here legally. They've entered legally in the United States. And you sometimes hear some of these activists, very vocal people say, what part of illegal immigration don't you understand? It's illegal, it's wrong, you're not supposed to be here. So I came across this really great little flow chart. It's a cartoon here called "What Part of Legal Immigration Don't You Understand?" And it really gets at the question of what does it take to enter the United States legally today in the 21st century? So I'd like you to take a look here and see if you can figure out what's the shortest period of time it would take to be able to get a visa. If you're a foreigner in another country and you want to get a visa to come into the U.S., how long is it going to take you, and what's the fastest route? What criteria do you have to meet in order to get into the U.S.?
What happens if, let's say your spouse, I have a friend who married a woman from Brazil. So I'm assuming she's here, I guess, with a green card now for 3 years, I mean, based on this. So what if she didn't pass this naturalization? Does she have to do that, or is she's?
The citizenship test?
Yeah,
Yes.
she's gonna have to do that
Yes.
after 3 years, or?
It's actually longer. The waiting time, the shortest time between when you get a green card to when you can apply to become a citizen, I believe, is 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, and then, so if she doesn't pass that test, then what? Does she get just one shot? Does she have, I mean, how does that work?
I think you take the test again, so you can reapply and try again. But I don't know how many times you have.
But there will be a limit.
And repay it, yeah. That's the other thing. I actually didn't have a chance to bring this, but my colleague who teaches with me, Professor Murphy, she had a great idea for our class next year. She said, I'm going to have students actually go to the ICE website, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and have them go through the process, pretend, not for real, but through the process of what it would be like to apply to come into the United States, to apply for a green card or visa. And have them see what the costs are, because it's rather expensive. The application fees are like $1,000. When you pay for the citizenship test, you got to pay for that, and there's all these different, it's not free, in other words. It's rather costly. So did anyone figure out what's the shortest time it would take to submit an application for a green card, get to the U.S., and actually become a U.S. citizen? 6 to 7 years, right. And that is, as in probably the case of your friend, where the immigrant is a spouse, has a U.S. citizen spouse, and
Or if you're David Beckham.
or if you're David Beckham, right, that's the other one. Yeah, you saw that one at the bottom. Yeah, so superstars, millionaires, if you've got money to invest in the U.S., the pathway in is fairly easy. But I want you to focus on, take a look at that bottom right corner, that little box there. It says, sorry, there is virtually no process for unskilled immigrants without relations in the U.S. to apply for permanent legal residence. Okay, only 10,000 green cards are allotted every year, and the wait time approaches infinity. This happens to be the case for most of the people who are undocumented. This is described as people who are undocumented here in the U.S. today. People who really have no other way to come into the U.S. legally. Yes.
Could you help us about a quota? What's the number of, immigration, the specific number of quota, who comes, and, the different criteria that's used?
Yes, I'm going to cover that in just a minute, yeah, so you can know what the numbers are exactly. So this is usually very eye-opening, particularly for students, because they really have no idea what it means then to apply to come into the U.S. Yeah.
What about refugees? Maybe it's on here someplace and I just haven't found it, but the process of going from a refugee to a citizen?
Yeah, that's not on here, I don't think. And that would be a different process, because refugees, if you apply for a refugee status or asylum, then there are kind of different channels that you go through. It's separate from this. This would be, I guess, what you would call, quote unquote, regular immigrants who don't have some kind of political refugee status. But if you know anything about, for example, refugees in Africa, from a variety of different places. I mean, they wait years and years. They might be in refugee camps in Kenya, for example, for almost a decade before they might be able to come finally to the United States. There's another question.
What about military service? Like, if you join the military and serve, 4 years, 5 years?
If you join the military, if you already have a green card in the U.S., then that's a fast route to citizenship. So instead of waiting 5 years, you only have to wait 3. And I'm going to talk about that later on too. Yes.
And this might be a little off, but like, I think my cousin married a guy who was here on a student visa or something. He's from Korea, I think. Well, I know, but then basically now they're married, and something about, as far as work, I mean, is there like, I know there's rules about like when you can and can't work, I mean, is that correct? Like if you have a certain type of visa?
Right. There are all kinds of restrictions depending on the type of visa you get, exactly. So if you have a work visa, there's certain restrictions about your travel and what kind of work you can do and for how long. What kinds of workers we recruit actually is also very important, and I'll talk about that in a second. And there was something else about what you said.
Well, if he came with a student visa, it's like, I don't even know what type of visas you apply for, I don't even know how that works.
Right, yeah, you could come, if people that come with student visas, sometimes what people will do is, they come study here and then they, marry or decide to stay for some reason, then they have to apply for that, to go through that process. And again, it's rather lengthy, I mean, it's not, immediate. But they're all, I mean, it's a very, very complicated system, and the rules are so arcane that most people usually, I mean, if you can afford it, you get an immigration lawyer to help you, walk you through the process. Yes? There.
This is a little bit, how many people who are permanent residents do choose to go through the naturalization process? Because recently I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who is a permanent resident, whose kid, but she wanted dual citizenship, and she said until I can get, she's like, I'm not gonna stop being Chilean to be American. So I was just questioning, like.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers of how many people are permanent residents that don't apply for citizenship.
Is it rare?
Well, your visa expires at some point, is the other thing you have to keep in mind. So you'll have to renew.
Well, she had a permanent resident card, so she was, I mean, she still had to renew it, but.
Right, so I don't know if you can renew it indefinitely. Yeah, I mean, it raises an important question for people, the choice that people make to become a U.S. citizen. And it's a very personal choice, right? There are all kinds of different factors.
Because still, I mean, if she didn't go through that process, if she couldn't get the dual citizenship, she still wouldn't be, a U.S. citizen, so she wouldn't have all the rights that a U.S. citizen, even though she's been here for 25 years.
Right.
So it's just an interesting that people do not want to leave that other citizenship behind, even to be United States as a quote-unquote, natural.
Right, and that raises a really good point, again, about looking comparatively at immigrants today versus immigrants in the past. We have this idea that immigrants in the past came here and that immediately the minute they got off the boat, they were committed to the U.S. And there's a famous photo of some immigrants waving an American flag and, as if they had embarked upon this voyage and there was no turning back. Actually, a lot of these immigrants went back home. 50% of Italian immigrants actually returned to Italy. I think of all nationalities, about a third of European immigrants during this time actually returned. So people had, again, the motivations for coming, their ideas that they had in mind, they wanted to come and work for a few years to save the family farm or to buy a plot of land or whatever. Very similar to the ideas that people have today, and why or why not they might not choose to, to become citizens. Yes?
Well, I just want to respond quickly to his question about people who come on student visa. There are a large number of the immigrants in the United States today, and they are the legal immigrants to be. And then just give you a snapshot of what their status is, how stable, unstable their status is. I know that a lot of students, they can easily lose their status by not completing. There are tons of things you have to do, like how many credits you have to register per semester. And any international student advisor can give you the information. But even after they graduate, they want to stay and work. The rules are such that it's very hard for them. And I can give you an example of a neighbor of mine who had to leave the country, in a week after living here for 8 years, just because he couldn't. He landed a job, but the job offer couldn't come in a very short window that the USCIS provided. So he has to leave the country, basically leave everything. He had lived in the country for 8 years and then just go back.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm gonna talk about that also, about what happens then when you stay, when you
Yeah.
overstay. Yes, and Margaret?
Yeah, now, if you're from Puerto Rico, what happens?
If you're from Puerto Rico, you have U.S. citizenship.
But can you vote?
If you're on the mainland. People in Puerto Rico cannot vote for the President of the United States. It's a Commonwealth, the status of Puerto Rico has been very contentious for, since 1898, that it's never been fully incorporated as a state. It's a territory, in 1952 it became a Commonwealth. And so the rights that Puerto Ricans have on the island are very limited. But they can come to the mainland just as someone from Arkansas comes to Ohio. Oh, yes, sorry, Carol, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
That's okay. The visa issue has touched this institute too. We started off, our team originally included somebody who had just graduated from OSU with a PhD. She's been teaching this year at a private school. She's on an H-1B visa. Her field is compatible with what we're doing, so there would be no problem there. But it's so restrictive that for her protection, we have to stop trying to include her in what we're doing. But, so the readings that you're doing right now, actually, your assigned readings, for the most part, came from her. That's some research that she did. So, it's everywhere. I've had a student that wanted to do an internship on campus. She's a Peruvian citizen, but a permanent U.S. resident. She had a terrible time, almost lost the internship because she was waiting over Christmas vacation for a police report from her hometown in Peru, which is in the mountains someplace. And it just, on and on, and every time we try to hire somebody to do something for us that is not necessarily a U.S. citizen, one of my first questions always is, I hate to ask you this, but what is your status?
Right, and again, the system is so cumbersome and complicated in the rules that it is very easy to violate one of the conditions upon which you've been allowed to enter the United States, and students in particular face this definitely. How many of you are social studies teachers or history, or what areas do you have?
I teach Spanish, but I also teach a class of 8th grade social studies, which is American history.
Okay, and the rest of you, what fields are you in?
First grade, so.
Okay, first grade, Anyone else?
Music.
Music, okay.
Spanish,
Spanish, okay. One of the things that might be interesting to do, those of you who have older students, high school students perhaps, would be to have them take the citizenship test. Have them try to take the test and see if they can pass it. Because one of the things that you'll find is that the citizenship test has like 100 questions. They won't test you on all of them, but you have to know the answers to all of them in case one of them comes up. And when they do these studies with American high school students, most high school students would not be able to pass it. So it's interesting to see how we require much more people who want to become U.S. citizens, and those of us who are already, we kind of take it for granted, right?
Does it focus on civics, or is it more historical? Or?
Yeah, it's, the Constitution, the U.S. presidents, that sort of thing, yeah. Yeah, and I'm sorry,
I just wanted to share that, what you talked about it, the restrictions on the visas are if you can be legal but not work legally.
Right.
Because you can be allowed to be in the United States, but you may not have a work visa, which is
Right.
totally different. And for a long time, I had in my social security card because I had a social security number, and people think you have a social security number, you're allowed to work. But actually, my card said only valid to work with INS authorization, and I had to get authorization, especially, and it's at least $120 per year. So, and that was a long time ago. So the fact that you can be here legally doesn't mean you can work legally or participate in volunteering or any social activity. So it is very restricted in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And, someone raised a question earlier about refugees and people applying for asylum, and that's an entirely different category that I really won't get into today, but they're told, completely separate rules for people that are applying as refugees. So, how do we get to this system today, this current existing system of the way it works? So let me go through some of this history very, very briefly. As a result of a lot of that anti-immigrant sentiment that there was towards these Southern and Eastern Europeans coming at the turn of the century, there was enough of it marshaled to get to Congress and to pass what was called in 1924 the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which is the first time that we really start, apart from, as I said, restricting Asian immigration, the first time that we start restricting other groups as well. So the Johnson-Reed Act restricted European immigration and established national quotas. Each year, we would admit 2% of whatever that national group's population was in 1890. Now, you'll notice this is passed in 1924, and we're going all the way back to 1890 to the census to see what the population was then. Why is this? Because actually, those immigrant groups who we didn't like at this time anymore, they were a pretty small number in 1890. 1890, most of the population would have been from Northern and Western Europe. So this was very intentional in trying to restrict Southern and Eastern European immigrants. And that's exactly what it did. About 85% then of the allotments that were available were reserved for Western and Northern European immigrants. Since their numbers were higher in 1890, 2% meant a much larger number that could enter the country each year. The Western Hemisphere, this is very interesting because again, if you don't know the historical context, you don't understand how, then you don't really think about how this has changed over time. The Western Hemisphere was entirely exempted from these restrictions. Anyone coming from Canada, from Latin America, from the Caribbean, this did not apply to them. And by and large, at this time, in the 1920s, there was not a lot of concern about Latin American immigrants, specifically Mexican immigrants, because they were the most numerous coming during this time, and many had come as a result of the Mexican Revolution. So by the 1920s, about 1.5 million Mexican immigrants had come into the U.S. In the last couple of decades. But we're not concerned at this time with Mexican immigrants at all in terms of restricting them numerically. But we do establish rules to regulate that immigration. We do say, that there are some people, particularly in the West, in the Southwest, in California, and places that are kind of raising alarms about this group of immigrants coming from the South. And they say, well, we need to at least regulate them, because prior to this, the U.S.-Mexico border was entirely open. I mean, people just came and went as they pleased, and people had lived for centuries, on both sides of the border. So, Johnson-Reed Act is actually what established the Border Patrol. This is when the Border Patrol was created, 1924, both with Mexico and the Canadian border. And as I said, this is the first time that Mexican and these other immigrant groups are regulated, because they can still continue to come, but now they have to pass inspection the way that people have been doing in these other places, and need to fulfill these criteria. Pay an $8 head tax, which at that time was a lot of money. If you think about the average wage being maybe about 30 cents an hour. Pay for $10 for the visa. Prove that they were literate in English or Spanish, but they had to be literate in order to enter the country legally. And pass that test that they would not become a quote-unquote public charge. So they were going to be able to support themselves, or someone would respond for them, that they would take care of them financially. And they could not be contracted laborers. Because this is one of the complaints that some people had, was that American companies would go and recruit workers from Mexico in particular, and bring them into the U.S. So this is the beginning of when we start to restrict immigration from Latin America. Now, fast forward to 1965, and can it change the slide, or still writing down? Okay.
Would you allow us to get a copy of that?
Of the PowerPoint, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
I think Erica had emailed me asking if
okay.
if it was okay to post it publicly or just to the website for the class, and if you could just put it for the class, that'd be fine. Yeah.
Okay, so you guys will have that.
Yeah. So I'll leave that with you. Okay. So 1965. There's another Immigration Act that happens in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act, which I won't talk about, but this is the next big one that's really important in shaping our policies today. This is a watershed moment for immigration, and this is often the point that people look to and say, this is when Asian immigration and Latin American immigration starts to increase dramatically over this time, and African immigration in much smaller numbers. That's increased actually since the 1990s.
Real quickly, kind of following our timeline as we go around, and I was thinking 1940s.
Mhm.
When did, or has it always been this way, that American sentiment kind of went against immigration? Like, I remember hearing stories of boats of Jews fleeing Europe,
Mhm.
being turned away and sent back to certain death
Mhm.
in concentration camps
Mhm.
because Americans did not want them here.
Mhm.
Has it always kind of been that way, or is this kind of a new thing from like 1940s on, that America's just been no,
Mhm.
no? I'm just
Mhm.
kind of curious.
The restrictions, the legal restrictions that we established really started in the 1920s.
Okay.
Like there were some laws passed in 1917 and 1919, but it's really a 20th century phenomenon when we really started to say no to people. And what happens in between this time, between 1924 and 65, is that people are still coming in much smaller numbers from Europe because they've got these quotas now. And it's not until after World War II, when the Holocaust is happening and and the war and everything, that we established these different status categories for refugees. There was one that was used very commonly during this time called displaced persons, DP, people who were displaced by the war in Europe, and then people seeking asylum. So it's a rather unfortunate fact, but historically we always have been very wary of foreigners, and each immigrant group has kind of gone through this process of being denigrated and mistreated, and then one or two or three generations later turns around and does the same thing to the next wave of immigrants.
Even though we originally were all foreigners.
Exactly. I mean, unless you're Native American, right? I mean, we all came from somewhere else, right? So 1965 is this key moment for a few really important reasons. This is when we start to see this new wave, the next new immigrants from Asia and Latin America. But we finally ended those quotas. Okay, think about the civil rights movement, think about the social movements that are happening in the nation at this time, the Vietnam War, and people are becoming much more open-minded in their ideas about race, social issues. And so we say, you know what, having these quotas is a little bit, embarrassing for the nation. We need to, be a little bit more progressive about this. So this really liberalizes immigration laws for Europe and actually also for Asia. At this point, there are no more restrictions against Asian immigrants. But, ironically, this is the first time that we established numerical quotas for the Western Hemisphere. And it's 120,000 for the entire region, no matter where you're from Canada, Mexico, Haiti, Chile. And it's on a first-come, first-served basis. It's not country-specific. So once we hit the 120,000 each year, that's it. Can't come in. So, some other things that this law does. This establishes these preference categories for family reunification and for spouses and children, parents, that sort of thing. But it doesn't mean that it's that easy to get in. I have had a colleague who, her family's from Vietnam. She's born in the US, but her father came to the US as a student, I think. He got his PhD here and ended up staying. He's a chemistry professor. And he applied for his brother to get a green card to come into the US. Well, it took them 20 years to finally get a green card for his brother to join him here in the United States. So even if you, fit in one of these categories, and they're prioritized. So spouses are first, minor children, I think, then parents, et cetera. There's an order to this. But even if you fit one of these categories, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to enter very quickly. Sorry, I lost my place on my notes here. This is why I'm confused. Sorry, this bullet point is in the wrong place. I think it should be on the next slide, and I'll get to that in a second about exemptions for parents of U.S.-born children. But the other thing that the Immigration Act establishes is this preference for skilled worker recruitment. These are those H-1B visas and others. And just to give you an example of what that means, and why, for example, we start to get such an increase in Asian immigration during this time. H-1B visas essentially are to recruit or allow entry to skilled workers, people with technical backgrounds in particular. And between 1966 and 1977, as Vijay Prashad notes in his book, 83% of South Asian Indians actually, who immigrated into the United States enter under this category as professional or technical workers. And we specifically think about the context of the Cold War and our fears about the Soviet Union and you know, our kind of our political anxieties. We're looking for you know, people who are scientists and engineers as we're developing our nuclear arsenal, for example. So 20,000 South Asian Indian immigrants come in, are scientists with PhDs, 40,000 engineers, 25,000 doctors. If you look at nurses as well, when we have nursing shortages, we recruit a lot of nurses from East Asian, South and Southeast Asian countries. And so we, by design, have recruited and attracted the most technically skilled, the most highly educated immigrants from this region of the world. And that, of course, becomes overrepresented here, and that's why we get these stereotypes. Oh, Asians are really good at math and science, and you know, the kinds of things that we hear, because the people that we are allowing to come into the country have to be really good at math and science. These are, you know, this is who we want to recruit. And so this is the birth of this visa, this policy of letting people come into the country if they are skilled in some way that we need. So back to the Immigration Act. This is the very first time ever, so only about 50 years old, right? The very first time ever that we restrict Mexican immigration by quotas, numerically. Again, prior to this, we hadn't really focused on Mexican immigrants specifically. But what the Immigration Act does, once it establishes this 120,000 quota for the entire hemisphere, is that it severely restricts and disadvantages Mexico, which was already a big sending nation, especially after the Bracero program. And I won't have time to explain this in detail, but I'll tell you very briefly. During World War II, when we had severe labor shortages, when workers are going to urban areas and we didn't have a lot of farm labor, we established a program to recruit Mexican men as temporary contract workers into the United States. This is called the Bracero program. It was supposed to be during the war, but as you might imagine, southwestern agricultural interests really liked having these low-paid contract workers who essentially were pretty much captive because they had to fulfill their contract, and who didn't have a lot of rights. They weren't citizens, they're foreign nationals. So the program continued until 1964. But the Bracero program was really important in that it became the kind of venue for migration during these decades. It really established this pattern of immigration, and particularly of temporary immigration from Mexico to the U.S. Altogether, about 4.5 million men came through the Bracero program in the span of about 22 years. So this interest in migrating north in many ways came from us. We recruited these workers. We sought them out and we brought them here. We said, we want you to come work on our farms. During the war, on the railroads also. But our relationship with Mexico then is much more complex than we think. It's not just that people want to come here and that we don't want them, but we've actually at times wanted them here and recruited them actively. I should mention that the recruitment of agricultural workers continues, particularly from the Caribbean, from Jamaica and places in Central America as well, with, I think it's called an H-2 visa. There's a way in which employers can recruit agricultural workers to work in sugarcane harvesting, for example, in Florida and in other crops. So, 1965 Act severely restricts immigration from Mexico. And we fast forward again a few years to 1976, and this is an immigration act that's not very well known at all, the Western Hemisphere Act, sponsored by Congressman Eilberg. And this is also really important, though, for understanding Mexican immigration today. One of the things it did is that it maintained those preferences for family reunification and for skilled workers, so that didn't change. But here's what's really important. This ended the exemption of labor certifications for parents of U.S.-born children. What does that mean? Prior to 1976, if your children were born in the United States, but you were a foreign national, that gave you a path to get a green card. Okay? So for example, Mexican immigrants who live near the border, if their children were born on this side of the border, and this was the case with my grandmother actually, this is how my family immigrated. My grandmother had her children in the United States, and she was able then to apply for a green card for herself and my grandfather. And then they had to wait and go through the process, and eventually they became citizens years later. But in 1976, we closed that door. No longer can you apply for a green card if you have US-born children. So it's really ironic because today you hear this term thrown around of anchor babies. People say, oh, women come and have their children here just so that they can, become, get access to social services and become legal immigrants. Today, if you have US-born children, you still have to apply. Your children can apply to get you a green card, but they can't do it until they're adults, until they're over the age of 21. So that's a really long anchor that you're leaving then if you think that if people think that that's how people are going to get legal status here. You have to wait until your children are adults. This is where, going back to the numbers, I think someone asked about what are the numbers today. This is where we established our current quotas, which is 20,000 visas per country for the entire Western Hemisphere. Okay? So only 20,000 people can come in who don't fit these other criteria, family reunification, or they're skilled workers, or refugee, or applying for refugee or asylum status. But I should also add that applying for refugee or asylum status from Latin America is very difficult. More frequently happens for people from African and Asian and Eastern European countries. So as you can see over time, this is becoming increasingly harder and harder and harder to immigrate into the U.S. legally. And this law in particular was specifically targeted at Mexican immigration. And I'll give you some policy analysis here right after the law was passed. This author said that the only country in the Western Hemisphere which substantially exceeds 20,000 persons per year at the present time is Mexico. When the new law becomes effective, 20,000 allotment for Mexico will be reached with very few numbers available for old registrants, people who are already in line. Moreover, the other changes in the law will greatly curtail the number of qualified immigrants from Mexico. So, 1977, scholars are already identifying this is going to make it much harder for people from Mexico to come into the country legally. He continues, the new law has obvious deficiencies which many believe are so acute as to negate its positive aspects, particularly the severe curtailment of immigration from Mexico and the elimination of the exemption from labor certification for parents of minor United States citizen children. So, very clear at this time, what we were doing. We didn't really talk about it. And this emerged in many ways because there was already a lot of unauthorized immigration coming into the U.S. during these decades. But as you might imagine, this starts to create this growing concern over quote-unquote illegal immigration. And you see that it dates back pretty far. This is from 1984, the cover of Newsweek magazine. Closing the door, the angry debate over illegal immigration, and underneath that address sticker, I think it says crossing the Rio Grande. And a couple of things that you should know about this is that this concern has focused specifically on Mexican and later on other Latin American immigrants. And it's focused only on the U.S.-Mexico border. Yes?
Perhaps being a media scholar makes me look at this, but it's interesting how that cover ties, the subtitle above, the heroin warlords, it sort of ties immigration to drugs. Even just implicitly, the juxtaposition of, oh, look at these horrible things happening that could be penetrating our borders,
Right, and isn't it so interesting that these are the same concerns that we have today, right? With heroin coming from Afghanistan and with drug production, and then the drug wars, from Mexico that have been rerouted from Colombia, basically, in this direction. So yeah, this is 1984. Yeah. And of course, you see the image. The image is very powerful, also, right? And what it suggests. This elderly old woman who looks like she has a cane and has to be carried across the river is going to come be a burden to us, right? we're gonna have to take care of her. So this is this growing concern over this issue. And I'll give you this quote to consider from someone who says, let's do away with the term illegal aliens, which is a technical legal term. This is why people use this, and although many people find it incredibly offensive. Let's do away with the term illegal aliens. In fact, let's do away with the illegal status that plagues millions of workers without documents who live and work in the United States. In recent months, unemployment and inflation have once again focused attention on undocumented workers and their families. They have become the scapegoats of the present downturn and are treated as if they personally brought it about. The problem of illegal immigration will never be solved with deportation raids and repressive legislative proposals. The truth is that when the United States is prospering, we welcome these humble workers from Mexico. When we hit a slump, we use deportation raids and legal repression to dispose of them. Now, this could very much apply to today, 2011, right? And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But this is actually from 1975. So this issue has been going on for decades, that we've had these restrictive laws, we know we need workers, we let them come essentially in this illegal status, and we don't really reform the laws in ways to change these dynamics. So, what makes immigration illegal? Just to kind of recap some of this. These quotas, which on their surface seem to be egalitarian, right? Every country has a chance to send 20,000 people each year. Don't take into account the fact that populations in the sending nations are very different. And I'll show you, I don't know if you'll be able to read it very well, but I'll show you a chart in a second of populations in Latin America. So what this means, though, is that Mexico, Iceland, tiny countries like Belgium, countries like Guatemala, all have the same number of visas that they can apply for. And clearly, immigration from Belgium, the need to immigrate from Belgium today is not that high, right? There aren't a lot of people flocking here from Belgium, from Iceland, or from these other places, right? So countries with the highest demand, which are by and large Mexico and Central America, and increasingly South America, are limited in the number of visas. So this makes legal immigration extremely difficult, incredibly difficult. As you saw on that chart, you know, if you're an unskilled worker, if you don't have family already in the US, it's incredibly difficult to be able to apply for a visa. So here's this table, and hopefully you can see it all. But these are demographics from 2005 from the Pew Hispanic Center. If any of you are ever interested in doing research on the Latino population in the US, it's pewhispanic.org. It's a great policy analysis center, think tank. They do really great reports and things. These are the figures they produced in 2005, showing different Latin American nationality groups and what their numbers are in the United States. That first column on the left. What percent of the Latino population they compose, and then what their populations are in the home countries. So what do you see here? What can you tell? Or what stands out to you about these populations, who's here in the US, and what helps to explain some of that?
Sorry, you said this is the number of people who are here now from all these?
Yes, in 2005. This is the number of people from these national origins.
So other than like proximity, I mean, because Mexico's closer, I mean, is that the other, you were talking about observations or whatever?
Yeah, that's a really important thing that I absolutely wanted to bring up, is the fact that Mexico, of all of Latin America, is our closest neighbor, right? We share a 2,000-mile border with it. So doesn't it make sense? I mean, anywhere you go in the world, the largest number of migrants are generally going to come from the closest countries around that country, right?
And it has the largest, by far, population in that whole country.
Exactly, right. This is why Mexican Americans, people of Mexican descent, are 64% of Latinos in the United States. I mean, compare that to the numbers from Costa Rica. There's only 4 million people in Costa Rica, which pales in comparison to 109 million people in Mexico. Uruguay, Bolivia, their numbers are relatively small here in the US. I was talking to the wife of a colleague one time and explaining that, you know, what I study Latino migration and about my research project that got Mexican and Puerto Rican labor migration to the US. And she really kind of didn't seem interested in that. She said, well, what about Brazilians or other immigrants? And I explained to her, well, the largest populations in the US are from Mexico. You know, the largest number is from Mexico, and you know, for a very logical reason. Again, they're our closest neighbor, they're the largest country. Brazil actually has a larger population than this, but I think I've got the map on the next page. Yeah, look at the distance. Right? Look how much further away Brazil and these other South American countries are from the United States. And this geography also explains class differences in immigrants. If it's harder to come from way down here and you're, you know, a farmer, you're not, you know, you're working class, the likelihood that you're going to be able to get all the way up to the United States is much less than if you're closer. So the further away people are going to be, the more likelihood that they might be middle class or, you know, have more economic means, and that they actually might travel by plane as opposed to, you know, crossing the border like a lot of Central American and Mexican immigrants do, and some South American immigrants. Actually, I've heard stories of people traveling by land all the way from Ecuador and other places to come to the U.S. across the U.S.-Mexico border.
Do you?
So questions?
Sorry.
Yeah. Let me stop for questions and then we'll continue. Yes.
Just curious if that geographic proximity is a factor related to the class. Then do you have a data in terms of among the Mexican immigrants, what percent of them are actually from lower social, you know, economic class? You know, like.
I don't have the figures, but what I can tell you kind of more qualitatively is that people, of course, who are coming from lower class status, you know, lower class backgrounds in their home countries are probably going to more likely to be undocumented here in the U.S., right?
Okay.
But that is not always the case either. So I don't want you to think that everyone who's undocumented is, you know, isn't educated, you know, didn't come from some kind of educational background or some kind of professional work. Because what you find also in the United States with a lot of immigrants is downward occupational mobility. So people who in their home countries, especially I found people from South America, Central America, and Mexico as well, from throughout the region, people who in their home countries were teachers, were secretaries, were photographers, you know, engineers, chemists, people who had degrees and had gone to college and studied in their home countries, end up coming here, and if they don't have papers, end up working as janitors, as, you know, working at the airport, and this is true also for immigrants from other parts of the world, African immigrants especially. For example, you know, I've met custodial staff at OSU, this man who was a lawyer in Eritrea. And he, you know, we started talking one time. He was telling me how he's traveled. He said, oh, you know, he asked me where I was from. I said, well, my family's from Mexico. He said, oh, I've been to Mexico. And he started telling me he's traveled to all these places in Europe and everything. He's a, you know, very well-educated man. He had been a lawyer in his country, and here he's, you know, cleaning offices at the Ohio State University. So that happens for a lot of immigrants. Yes.
Yeah. Well, two things now. Refugees tend to. This thing tends to happen to refugees too, when they lose status, and so
Yes.
accreditation is very difficult.
Yes.
Now, what I wanted to say about her question, in the research that I do, which is about transnational Mexicans, about 20% of the Mexican population in Mexico is of ranchero background. Rancheros are the ones in the little villages, rural areas, and 75% of Mexicans in the United States are of ranchero background. So does that make sense? So 20% of the overall are the ones, and they're the 75% of those are the ones that live in the United States. So that will give you an idea of the population that is a migrant. And many, actually the main reason was the Bracero program. They were recruited to work in the railroads and in the farmers.
Right, and again, this makes sense, right? Because these are going to be the people with the most economic need. You know, if you're, you know, a skilled professional in your country and, you know, you make good wages, then you're probably not going to want to leave your country, you know, leave your family and everything. But, you know, if you're really struggling, and I'll talk in a second about NAFTA and its relationship to immigration. If you're really struggling as a farmer, as, some, lower wage worker, then you're gonna look for your options wherever they can be, whether it means moving to the big city or, leaving the country.
So then, the people who own the restaurants here and the food trucks, the majority of those people are descendants of rancheros. They're like second, maybe the next generation? Or-
Well, I mean, I'm tapping into Dr. Farr's research, because she does the one on the first generation. But the taco trucks, they're different. I mean,
But they're mostly first generation immigrants,
yeah,
right? Those
they're
are first generation.
But some of them, the ones that work on the fields or work on factories, those are the ones that come from that 20% Mexicans. The others, of course, they're more urban Mexicans, but that doesn't mean that the education, just like what the speakers told you on Tuesday, the migration from little ranches or farms to the urban areas in Mexico. So they were at some point rancheros, but they no longer come from the little villages. They come from the urban areas. Those are the ones that you will find in taco trucks or building businesses.
Mm-hmm.
But that is, I don't know, maybe Dr. Farr will kill me for saying this, but maybe they're second generation rancheros that are not really the farmers themselves, but they're children of farmers who have moved into cities, but they still have that social class attached to them.
Yeah, and the other thing, I don't want to leave you with the misconception that everyone that's coming from Latin America is coming from rural places either, because there are a lot of urban people coming. The people, especially from South America and Central America, tend to be urban people. People who've been in big cities, in Mexico as well, at least for some time, and then come up north.
Yeah, I see Bolivia, Colombia, and the USA, they're green. Is it special meaning, the colors, the yellow ones?
No, I don't know why. I just got this map off the internet.
I thought that means, the Colombian cartel and the Bolivian cartel.
There's some kind of affiliation or something. Yeah, Guatemala's also in green. Yeah, no, I don't know if it has any significance. Yeah. So I wanted to share, these demographics with you so that you understand the composition of the population here in the U.S. and why it is that Mexicans are so overrepresented for the reasons that we've discussed, and why other groups are so much smaller in number. Panamanians, for example, only 141,000 Panamanian people in the U.S. They come from a very small country, so there are very few people that would be coming. In that of many others.
How about Colombia?
Colombia is actually the second largest Latin American country with 44 million. But they have fewer than 800,000 people. Again, think about the distance and what it takes to migrate from somewhere further away. The largest country besides the U.S. in the hemisphere is Brazil. But Brazil's not included on here, I think, because they're counting people who are of Spanish-speaking countries, and in Brazil, of course, they speak Portuguese. But Brazil has a population close to 200 million, I believe, and those numbers are their numbers are increasing here in the U.S. as well.
The Spaniard at the bottom, self-identified, what does that mean?
I think that people who would claim Spanish ancestry from Spain, that they're from Spain. Yeah.
Oh.
I think that's what that means. Yeah, although they don't have the numbers here.
So Lily, would that be like people in New Mexico that say, I'm Spanish? That
That
have been
might
here for
be.
years but say, I'm Spanish.
Yeah.
Right, they don't say that they're
That they're right. That
Oh.
they're Mexican.
Latinos, no,
Yeah.
I'm Spanish.
So-
They trace their heritage from Spain.
And that is like a whole can of worms, which I'm not going to get into in terms of issues of race, because it's very complicated, the politics of how people identify, and some people say that their roots come from Spain, they're European, and other people, are kind of question a little bit more and think about the racial politics of the U.S. and Latin America, and how people always want to claim whiter origins, right? For all kinds of historical and political reasons. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna ask whether it was political, perhaps. So I remember one time some years ago, meeting a woman who said she was from Persia. And I was thinking, Persia, I don't think there's a nation of Persia anymore. And then I realized, she's from from Iran.
Right.
She didn't want to say she was from
From
Iran.
Iran, yeah. So that's, yeah, it's really complicated. I mean, I could do a whole other lecture just on, on people, how people identify and all of that, the reasons for it. So, okay, so there's our map, just again to orient you where folks are coming from. And I want to thank you, by the way, for being patient and going through this, staying attentive, because this is really complicated and dense stuff, Immigration policy history is not the most exciting thing, I don't think. But I've come to find it really fascinating, because I think it explains so much about so much today. Okay, these, I'm gonna skip these right now, because I've got them on a handout, so I won't go through them. But, some immigration facts. Actually, I'll put that first one up. So you can take a look at it if you want. But I'm giving it to you in this handout form so you have it. Again, to give you a sense of how immigration has changed over the last century, and how, despite what some people claim that we're being overrun by immigrants, not only Latin Americans but other immigrants from other places. Immigrants are actually 11% of the population in 2000. They were actually a slightly higher proportion of the population a century ago. And the sources for all of these are here on the bottom. They're on the sheet, so if you're interested in doing more research or looking this up. This is a really important thing that I'll point out, though, actually on your sheet. Only 40% of people who are in the United States unlawfully actually come across the U.S.-Mexico border. Only 40% of the quote-unquote illegal immigration comes across that border, and yet that is the focus of our attention, right? We keep saying we've got to close the border, we've got to, especially in the whole, in the climate of the war on terrorism and post 9/11. But another 40% of people who are here unauthorized are just overstaying visas. People who have these student visas, tourist, business visas, and they're from all over the place. Okay. Undocumented immigrants from, I don't know if it's Mexico, only Mexico, or Latin America entirely, are about 2/3 of the entire undocumented immigrant population. So there's the estimates today that there are 10 million people who are unauthorized in the U.S., but maybe 6 point something million of them would be from Mexico. In the 1980s, we had a huge undocumented immigrant population from Ireland, for example. A lot of Irish, quote-unquote, illegal immigrants. From Eastern Europe, from all these other places. Question?
Just a clarification, when you were talking about the quotas and the visa quotas, so that would include all of these different kinds of, the visa quotas doesn't necessarily mean that those people can stay here indefinitely, or?
Well, as long as they don't break the law and, they.
So the visa just kind of gets them into the country, and the quotas that we've established just get the people into the country, and then after that, then it would, either this would happen or you would renew the visa.
Yeah, so there's 20,000 per country. Okay, so let's say, for example, India. India has 20,000 visas just for anyone, someone off the street that says, hey, I want to go to the U.S. They can apply, and again, they're going to be, evaluated by these criteria and things to see whether or not we give them a visa. Those 20,000 people can come in for that year. Apart from that, then, if Microsoft or Oracle or one of these, Silicon Valley companies wants to hire engineers or, scientists, web developers, whatever, they apply for those H-1B visas separately. So they're not included in that number. And if there are people who want to apply to come join a spouse or some family member, they're not included in that 20,000 quota either. So there are more people that come besides the 20,000. But if you're not in one of those other categories, if you're not a computer engineer or, or a minor child of an immigrant, then it's going to be really hard to get in. Yeah. And that's why people, this is a strategy that some people use too. They'll come on a student or work or tourist visa, and then they decide they're going to stay.
But I guess, it doesn't, the 20,000 doesn't necessarily mean that they'll stay or that they're coming to.
Right, they might go back. Yeah, those 20,000 also, right, some people might go back. Here's another really important point that I want people to notice, is that the United States receives only 1% of all the immigrants moving all over the world. There's so much immigration happening outside of the United States. And this really stunned me when I first discovered this, because, you know, I focus on immigration in the US, and you think that, you know, the way we talk about it, like, everyone in the world wants to come here to the United States. No, that's not actually true. A lot of people are migrating to Europe, to Africa, to Asia, within Latin America, within these regions. 99% of them are not coming to the US.
You have a list of the criteria that is used, you know.
For people, you know what, I didn't bring it, I didn't bring a list like that. If you go onto the USCIS website, you can find that information there.
What the criteria that is used.
Yeah,
in
what
order
the
to-
criteria are.
How much it costs, you know, because you may apply and pay, you know,
Right,
and you still don't get the visa.
right, exactly, yeah. But so, that always surprises people, this last figure, you know? I mean, think about people that are migrating internally within Africa, within Latin America, in Europe, Middle East. Our numbers here, I mean, we're tiny, we're speck.
Do you know which countries receive the most immigrants?
I don't. I know Canada gets a lot of immigrants, more than we might think. But I don't know which country, you know, in total numbers, sheer numbers, has the highest number of immigrants coming in.
How about, do you have the number of how many refugees versus immigrants?
Versus, yeah, non-refugee.
Which one is higher?
No.
Refugee or the immigrant?
No, immigrants are higher. Yeah, refugees, again, you, just because you apply for refugee status doesn't mean that you're gonna get, you know, gain entry into the country. Okay, so, some more, 3/4 of the legal immigrants today are people that are coming to join a family member. About 25% of the total immigrant population in the US is actually undocumented. And this is an interesting question. You've got to answer there. Where do most refugees who resettled in the US come from? It's actually the former Soviet Union. We might think that they're more coming from Iran, from Vietnam, from these other places, but it's actually all of the new nations out of the former Soviet Union. Okay, so next big immigration reform act, which some of you actually might remember, since this is, you know, from our times now, is IRCA in 1986. IRCA was really, really important and was somewhat interesting because it was rather contradictory in some ways. This is a law that established employer sanctions for employers who knowingly hire undocumented immigrants, people who are not legally authorized to be here. There's supposed to be penalties for this. You're supposed to pay a fine. I don't know if there's jail time, but if you knowingly hire people with an illegal status, it's against the law. That's what this law established. But of course, there are ways around this. So the way that they do this is that that they verify is with the I-9 form. The I-9 form that we all fill out when you apply for a job somewhere. You've got to show proof of legal rights to work in the U.S., your birth certificate, your social security card, your driver's license, that sort of thing. Your employer is supposed to verify that your papers are accurate. So, how do they get around this? 2 ways. One, of course, is accepting fraudulent documents. And of course, that's become a huge industry now, right? People that want to come work in the U.S., they need to have some kind of paperwork to you know, state that they can legally work here. The other way they do it is subcontracting. The way employers, you know, wash their hands of this and they're not held responsible. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're Target or Walmart or Kroger, you know, as an example. You need maintenance or custodial staff to come clean your stores at night, or, you know, when the stores close, to clean your stores, clean the bathrooms, that sort of thing. You could hire your own workers. Walmart can hire its own workers, or you can hire a company to come do this work, right? And they bring their workers, a cleaning company, that sends their workers into clean your stores or whatever. And the cleaning company now becomes responsible for making sure that those people have a, you know, are authorized to work in the U.S. So the big store is no longer responsible. So they can't be blamed for this. They can't, you know, they're not held responsible for this, and they can just say, we didn't, you know, I didn't know if these workers were authorized or not. And that's what's happened more and more. It also means, subcontracting also means that you can pay a lot less, right? Because now Walmart or whoever doesn't have to pay you health insurance or benefits, you know, unemployment compensation, all that kind of stuff. Was there a hand up? No? Okay, sorry. So this, the way that our immigration policies have changed and the way that, are very much connected also with the way our economy and our labor markets have changed. Some other things about IRCA, it actually increased dramatically the funding for the Border Patrol, and I'll show you some figures in a second. It gave the president the authority to declare an immigration emergency, which is rather interesting because, I guess what this does is that the president wants to, you can declare there's an immigration emergency, so I'm gonna take certain measures or send troops down to the border, which is what we're seeing now, right? Militarizing the border. And here's the last part of this that is just so interesting and kind of seems counterintuitive. But IRCA actually offered amnesty for people who had been working in the U.S. Unauthorized, but could prove that they had been here for at least 5 years. This was huge. This was huge in 1986 because this opened the door for so many people who had been here for years, working and living, raising families, etc. And finally, they had this period where they could come forth. They had to pay a fine. I think it was like a $2,000 fine, and apply for a green card. And many, many people did. I think I've got the figures on the next slide. Yeah, 3 million people came forward and applied. 2.6 million of them from Latin America. So this had been a big complaint at that time, much like today, right? That, well, we don't want people here illegally. We want to know who these people are. They need to, go through the system and apply for a green card, and they did. Question?
I was just scratching my head, but I do
Oh,
have a question.
sorry.
I do have a question though.
Okay.
It just occurred to me, how concrete are we about the numbers that we're learning about? Like, I understand we know about this 3 million people, but when we talk about undocumented immigrants, how are we counting them? What's the plus and minus on our numbers?
I have no idea how they arrive at these estimates. I don't know what measures they use. I don't know if anyone else could shed some light on this, but for a while, a few years ago, they were estimating there was about 11 to 12 million people who are in the country without papers. That number now they're saying has gone down since the economic recession, and it's now like 10 million. I want to say it's probably even lower than that. But I'm not sure how they arrive at these numbers, how we get this. So, we have to also kind of take it with a grain of salt, right? It could be a lot less. I don't know that it would be a lot more, because that's a pretty high number already, but it's, it could be. Yes?
What drives these different immigration acts? Is it primarily racism, or is it economics and other things?
I think it's a lot of things. When there's enough political support in Congress, that people, are convinced that we need to do something, to stop these people, certain groups of people from coming into the U.S., then that's when, we take action, right? And we do have to think about the origins of where people are coming from. We're not restricting, for example, at this point anymore, European immigration. If you look at our refugee and asylum policies, they're also very interesting. The way that we treat Cuban immigrants, people who are fleeing a communist country, is very different from the way we treat Haitians, for example, who are seeking asylum and refuge in the U.S., and other Central American immigrants coming from leftist countries. So it's very political, our relationships, this is very much tied to our relationships with these countries as well. And yeah, I think there's a lot that goes in there in terms of how politicians decide, I'm gonna take this position and I'm gonna advocate for this law or present this bill into Congress.
So it's really based on their own ideology.
I think that when we talk about immigration, most people really are not very well educated and informed about things, There are arguments to be made in all different ways. And if you look at economists and ask them, is immigration a good thing economically for the country or is it bad? They have all kinds of different answers. So it depends on who you go to. You can be flooded with economists who will say, yeah, immigration's bad, it's lowering wages, it's it's bad for American workers. And there is some truth to that. But then you also have economists who will say, but immigrants are contributing taxes, especially if they're undocumented and they don't have legal papers. They're actually paying into the system money that they're never going to see back. And I'll show you that in just a second. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important point. So yeah, so there are all kinds of different opinions. And I think that if you really were to inform yourself, if our political leaders were to inform themselves and educate themselves completely, they would be much more thoughtful about policies that they advocate. Okay, so we told people, okay, come forth, tell us that you're here unlawfully, apply for immigration, for a green card, and then we changed the rules completely. Everyone was saying, you know, the problem we have is with these illegal immigrants, we don't care, we like legal immigrants, right? They're fine, you know, but in 1996, this is during Clinton, during Newt Gingrich Congress, we passed the IIRIRA, which I won't go through, it's a long name, but this essentially denied services to legal immigrants. We basically said, you know what, even legal immigrants, we kind of have a problem with you too. So it's a little bit, you know, I don't know, I mean, you could say it's a little bit hypocritical of us, right? And again, I mean, going back to this question of why, I mean, think about who these immigrants are that are coming today. On that form you see, today, in 2000, 26% of our immigrants of any status are coming from Asia, 52% are coming from Latin America. So the composition of who's coming has changed significantly. And we're becoming increasingly restricted, even for people who are here legally.
What would they deny them?
So access to things like public assistance, that kind of stuff. Yeah, what you would consider welfare programs like WIC and those kinds of things. Yes?
Like Medicaid,
Really,
Medicaid.
because there are a lot of Somalis
That receive public assistance? Now, it might be because they have a different status. So that might be the reason why, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're not.
Okay, so what happens then? After we say, okay, even legal immigrants, even if you have a green card, you can't, apply for certain services. The applications for citizenship jumped up they tripled from over 500,000 to over 1.4 million in just 3 years. People said, hey, I've got to become a citizen. Yeah, exactly. So we see this huge increase in citizenship applications during this time. And it's because of this law, because of new options for dual citizenship in a lot of countries, and because of something in California, Proposition 187, which I won't have time to go into, but if you heard about this at that time, there was a very, very punitive, very restrictive proposition that was passed, essentially to make life unbearable for immigrants in California, to make them want to go back. So this brings me to one interpretation of all of this, of our policies, of our economy, and what's been going on, that these two scholars, Jorge Duran and Douglas Massey, have made. They are sociologists, I believe. They've done this big, long, 25-year Mexican migration project studying immigrants both in Mexico and then people once they're here in the U.S. And they make this argument in this article from 2003 about the costs of contradiction, the cost of our contradictory immigration policies. So here's what they say. They say essentially that we have this contradictory policy of growing integration and increasing separation. Growing integration and increasing separation. And what do they mean? Essentially that the U.S. wants Latin America to open its markets, and you'll know what I'm talking about here in a minute, but that it does not want to open the U.S. to Latin America. And this is talking specifically about free trade, NAFTA, and our increasingly restrictive border patrol policy. This is what they say is at the heart of this contemporary quote-unquote immigration crisis that we talk about now. So, so two policies they're talking about, specifically that both get enacted in 1994, North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and Operation Gatekeeper. So NAFTA, and you've heard probably a lot about NAFTA in the news. People talk about how it's been bad for industry and manufacturing in the U.S., how jobs are going overseas and all these things. let's think about what NAFTA has meant from the other side. But what NAFTA established is essentially that it's eliminated tariffs on many things, on trade between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. So things can now, we can trade now much more freely without imposing import taxes for products and goods. And as a result of this, our trade with Mexico increased dramatically after 1994, going from 80 billion to 200 billion. Now we see a lot more produce coming from Mexico, and we see a lot more of our things going there without it being taxed. So it's making our goods from here much cheaper in Mexico as well. Business visas went up dramatically during this time. People coming from Mexico who wanted to come do business in the U.S. And legal border crossings went up significantly. From 114 million legal crossings per year in 1986, this is people who might come back and forth to work or to do business, to 213 million by 1998, so almost doubling. So free trade essentially means that goods and investments can come and go across the border. But you don't want people to come and go, and meaning people from the south coming north. And this is this contradiction that they're talking about. Operation Gatekeeper, which was started, I think the plans were originally begun under first President Bush. Clinton actually carried this out. But it was a crackdown on 3 traditional border crossing points. The place where most immigrants who were crossing the Mexico border came from. San Diego and Tijuana, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and then Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, which I think is further down here. Sorry, that's just a map of the U.S.-Mexico border more generally. But we decided we were going to crack down on people crossing illegally at these 3 places. The Border Patrol budget increased 6 times to 1986, and we increased the Border Patrol force to 10,000 officers. So a lot of people being employed by the federal government to patrol our border. So what were the consequences of this Operation Gatekeeper? Well, a number of things, and this is what we're seeing today, what we've been seeing for the last 15 years. More than that, actually, more than 15 years. So the illegal crossings decline, because now we've got people standing at these border points, that are going to keep people from coming in. Okay, so the crossings there are declining, the apprehensions are declining. Looks like we're doing a good job, right? But what Durand and Massey point out is actually we're just sending people to cross in more remote areas. People that still want to come here to work, they're going to find a way. And so now they're going through the desert, through the mountains, through much more difficult terrain where there's less Border Patrol staffing there, and where they're less likely to be caught. So this has made these crossings much more dangerous, and as a result, over 5,000 people, I'm not sure what the figures are now, this is a little bit dated, but more than 5,000 people have died crossing the border since the mid-1990s.
And deaths from conflicts with Border Patrol?
Any kind. So these could be people dying from exposure, from dehydration, from the elements, from injuries, yeah, everything.
Do you know what the number of deaths would have been prior to that, for comparison's sake?
No, I don't have the numbers previously. I don't think that people really started to keep very close track of this until after people started crossing through these more remote areas. Before this, it was much more likely that people would be crossing in these places, and in those 3 places that I mentioned. So, as a result of this, you've got people crossing in all kinds of remote areas, and now you've got ranchers who are encountering these people who are crossing, and they're getting really angry about this. Where are these people coming from? Why are they on my property? They're destroying my property, making a mess. And this is why you get this growing vigilantism and the rise of the Minutemen at this time. Because all of a sudden now, people who've owned property on the border for decades, for years, are finding people coming on their land. And I mean, we can understand why they'd be upset, but people decide to take up arms against this, literally, to stop it with violence. The other thing that's happened as a result of this since it's so much harder to cross to get into the United States, it means people are staying here much more permanently. And this is why we got this crisis, this political crisis of almost 12 million immigrants, undocumented immigrants that we talk about in recent years. Because the population actually doubled, is what the estimates say, from 1994 to 2004 of people who are unauthorized to be here. So we cracked down, we're making it harder for people to cross. They're staying here more permanently now, because before people might come and go, go back to see family and that sort of thing. Now they're staying here more permanently. And we're spending a whole lot more money on this, and it's not solving anything really, right? So this gives you a sense of how much we're spending on this. And this is just the last 8 years, 2002 to 2010. If you look at the numbers are separated out: Customs and Border Protection, and then ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We are spending over $16 billion, looks like $17 billion. And you see it's gone up dramatically, actually.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at how it's going, would this be primarily in direct response to the 9/11 issue? Or maybe, but they use that as an excuse for the crackdown on the border?
Well, 9/11 has a lot to do with it, right? People think that, there's people who are very vocal about saying that we need to close the border with Mexico because that's where terrorists come in, right? So that, there's definitely a lot of political support for that, right? For putting more money here for the border. And then more generally, just for keeping track of immigrants more generally, right? Because of the fears that we have post 9/11. Yeah, so that has a lot to do with it. I mean, that's certainly, our political climate is very different now than it, before 2001.
I would also say some of the laws have changed in ways that even it would restrict economies from growing. In Miami, Iberia Airlines, I'm a big aviation buff. They used to have a hub in Miami, and it connected people from Spain to all over Latin America. And you could get off the plane in Miami and you could connect and go to wherever else you needed to be. Well, they've changed the law where if you're from those countries, you have to have a special visa to be able to do that. So Iberia said too bad, and they moved everything to Costa Rica. So now you go to Costa Rica and you can go to wherever you need to go. But all because they changed the law where they want these people who are connecting, not even staying, just connecting. To have a visa. If they don't have it, you can't go. But there's no such restrictions for Canadians or whatnot.
Yeah, and the laws have changed in so many different ways since 9/11. Before 9/11, you could go to Mexico and come back into the U.S. with just your birth certificate. That's all you needed to show that you proved that you were a U.S. citizen, right? Now you actually have to have a passport. And I think it's true for Canada also, if I'm not mistaken, that if you're crossing in either direction, you've got to have a passport. So definitely the political climate has a lot to do with it, and our economy's changing has a lot to do with it, but it's all very much intertwined with the issue of immigration. So again, back to another way to restate this contradiction that Joanna Manti says, that we want open borders for trade and capital from the north to south, but not for people from south to north. Okay? So to give you a visual of what NAFTA means in Mexico, and I'm sure other people can talk about this at length. But free trade in the U.S. and Mexico in 2010. These are photos from a city in Mexico that's about 200,000 people, not very large. So this isn't Mexico City, Guadalajara, or some big cosmopolitan place. This is, little city in between the hills. And you can see how U.S. Corporations are just completely infiltrating places. Yeah, this one here, it's got not only Burger King, but Chili's and Starbucks. So we're getting our companies into Latin America. Here's more. Check cashing, pawn shop, First Cash. Because, people need to go get loans from pawn shops.
Sally's.
Yeah, Sally's Beauty. Office Depot, Domino. I mean, this is looking more and more like the U.S., isn't it? It's looking like a strip mall, here in Columbus. So we're making Mexico and increasingly other parts of Latin America more like us, but we don't want to become more like them. You know, we don't want, and it's essentially what our immigration policy suggests. So here's what Durand and Massey say, is that throughout the 20th century, the U.S. has arranged to import Mexican workers while pretending not to, making those policies restrictive. Politicians and public officials have persistently sought ways of accepting Mexicans as workers while limiting their claims as human beings. Okay. So, that's very heavy statement there. But this is their assessment in this long study that they've done, over 25 years of Mexican immigration and how our policies have
Don't you think
affected
that's
this.
really, we want to say that we've changed, but it's really the same old, from back to the African slavery time. Same type of stuff, just different faces.
Well, you raise a really good point. A colleague of mine who teaches African American history and does research in African American history, when the whole Arizona SB 1070 law was passed last year, she made a really great point that I thought was just so compelling. She said, this idea that you can stop anyone who's suspected to be an illegal immigrant sounds just like the fugitive slave laws of the 1850s.
Sounds like the Underground Railroad. If you're harboring an illegal, immigrant, then you can get in trouble. I mean,
Right,
like
right. She said, right, because at that time, fugitive slave laws meant that an African American person who was just found out in the public was automatically suspected of being a runaway slave.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, then you could be imprisoned, right? And we see very similar dynamics now, right? That if you're suspected, if you're out in public and caught, you're suspected of being here illegally in the United States, very similar consequences. So the last thing I want to leave us on, and I know we're running out of time here, is for us to consider, how is it that we, as Americans, as consumers, profit from this? How do we benefit from people being here illegally? Even though we politically we oppose it, we say that we're against this, why is this happening? As Jorge Bustamante says, 10 to 12 million undocumented people in the United States is not an accident. This is our policy. We haven't done anything to change this, to reform this policy. A number of points, and I'll pass actually the last thing I have here around, which are immigration myths and facts. But a number of things. One is, many economists point out that immigrant workers are actually replenishing our aging population. The baby boomers are getting old, they're leaving the workforce. We need people to continue, holding up the economy. 70% of immigrants arrive in prime working age, okay? This is really an interesting point. We're getting people who we haven't paid a penny for in terms of their education, raising them as children, that sort of thing. American corporations profit enormously from the low wages that they pay to undocumented workers. And there's a great movie, which I think I'll have in the bottom point, but what that means, so American corporations profit from this, from paying undocumented workers much lower than they would pay US workers. And for us, we profit by having lower prices for goods and services. You go to a place particularly like Southern California, okay? You can get your car washed by people for, $6. Washed, and, really cheap. Think about how so many people, again, in a place like Southern California, have gardeners, hire, housekeepers, maintenance, staff people that do kind of personal services for us because you can afford it because they're immigrants. And this is not new. And what I want to say, this has always been the case. We've always used the most recent people, whether it's African American migrants coming north, whether it's European immigrants coming to the cities. We've always used the most recent migrants as that low-wage labor. And in particular, I want to point out the food that we eat. That's, increasingly almost entirely being processed by undocumented. Has anyone seen the movie Food Inc.? A few of you have. Okay, so you remember there's a scene in there where at this meat packing plant, they go and do a raid at a trailer park, and yeah, it's a really disturbing scene. But if you have a chance, I recommend you take a look at it. It'll open your eyes about food and our food production in really fascinating ways. That will make you change the way you eat, probably. But, so to give you an idea, and again, to make these connections to labor, and who's done this labor historically. I'll give you this. During Florida's prime tomato picking season, from November to May, Norberto Jimenez rises at 4 a.m., 6 or 7 days a week to pack his lunch. He needs to be at the central parking lot in Immokalee, Florida, early if he wants to be selected by a crew leader and catch an early bus to whatever field is being picked that day. By the end of the working day, either 5 or 6 or 7 at night, he said, Jimenez has picked around 125 buckets of tomatoes, each weighing 32 pounds, for which he'll earn 40 to 50 cents a bucket. When the night bus returns to the parking lot, Jimenez will have earned somewhere between $50 and $60 for lifting 2 tons of tomatoes. So this just really powerfully, I think, gets at the labor that this population does in the United States, and how we don't think about it, we don't know it because we're not aware of this, right? And again, we can make connections historically to other populations, and we can think about what this means for us as consumers of these things. Let's see. I think I'm going to have to end here, but other ways in which undocumented immigrants contribute to the U.S. economy. This, I think, is really important that I want to share. First, we just read about agricultural laborers. The Department of Labor did a report a few years ago where they basically argued that migrant laborers' poverty, the poor wages that we pay them, actually subsidize the profits in agribusiness. But here is, I think, the most gripping point of all of this, and the biggest secret that we don't talk about at all. That is that those undocumented immigrants that are in the country using false Social Security numbers to work, they're paying into the Social Security system money that they're never going to see because they'll never be able to claim it. And there's a thing called an earnings suspense file, which is money that the Social Security Administration holds because it hasn't been, they haven't been able to match it up to the right person. The number and the person's name don't match. That account or whatever, that file has over $600 billion. And that's increased with interest over time. From what workers contribute. $600 billion that undocumented workers have contributed to the Social Security system. And you can see how the numbers increased dramatically at the same time that we did that Operation Gatekeeper, that we've done NAFTA and all these things. Yes?
A little thing on the Social Security Administration, and I don't know if this is a motive, what they don't want to give people citizenship. If someone gets a citizenship and can prove where the money has gone to, they can get it for their retirement. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and I don't know if that is a motive why they don't want it, because they want to keep the money, or maybe they're just not thinking about it. But I know that, yeah, if somebody worked for 50 years and had different Social Security numbers, if that person can prove that certain earnings were his or hers, the money would go to their account when they have their own Social Security.
They can claim it then,
They can claim it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, yeah. But this is something that, we hear so much in the news about Social Security system, it's bankrupt, people want to do away with it, they want to privatize it, all this stuff. One of the things that no one talks about is the fact that undocumented immigrants, these people that we're demonizing and that we hate so much, are actually the ones that are helping to sustain it. That's what's keeping the paychecks coming to grandma and grandpa, And grandma and grandpa oftentimes tend to be the ones who are the most vocal against, undocumented immigrants. The last 2 points here, and then we'll stop, is undocumented immigrants often overpay in federal and state taxes. There are ways that they can file a tax return to try to get some of that money back, but the estimates are that they overpay about 90 to 140 billion per year, give or take. And as a number of economists and scholars show, they actually access fewer social service programs than native-born U.S. citizens do. So we think that they come and they take all our resources. When you look at it all, when you do the math, this is why many scholars will argue that immigrants actually add value to the nation. They're contributing something. They're not just taking away. So I will leave it at that because we are over time, way over time. But any last questions?
So is there anyone that is like for example, lawyers, politicians, that is attempting to sort of raise the consciousness of the immigrants and to sort of understand some of this, and how might this be affecting the psyche of the families and the children that are coming to our schools?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. There's, I think there's some people who are very, you know, people who work very hard to try to educate people about immigration issues, and this is why there's so many people that are calling for reform. You know, I don't know what that reform will look like. You know, and again, as I said earlier at the beginning, there aren't any easy answers. You know, because this is such a complex thing. I mean, this has to do with the entire nation's economy, our relations with other countries. So I don't know that, you know, that people who understand this can give these little sound bites on the news, for example, or to politicians. What happens instead is you get the other sound bites, the other side that is saying, you know, oh, this is bad, we need to close the border, build a wall, these things, right? But that's not a complex understanding of the situation. Going to the issue of children, and this is, we're out of time, so I won't get to talk about this, but the way that this affects children, particularly the children that you might work with in schools, is that think about the vulnerability of their parents if they're here undocumented. One parent or the other, or both. We've increased our deportation rates, not only in workplaces, but in people's homes significantly in the last decade, because we're cracking down on this, right? So there's a great article by one of the men I quoted earlier, Eric Freire Camaidas, who talks about the deportation rates in Postville, Iowa in 2008. And what happened there, they came into this poultry, or this meat packing plant, and arrested 400 people. And this town had a population of like just a few thousand. And it had a devastating impact on the community, and particularly on the children in the schools. He says, at the local high school, only 3 of 15 Latino students came back on Tuesday, whereas the elementary and middle school, 120 of the 363 children were absent because their parents had been detained. In the following days, the principal went around town on the school bus and gathered 70 students after convincing the parents to let them come back to school. 50 remained unaccounted for. Some American parents complained that their children were traumatized by the sudden disappearance of so many of their school friends. The principal reported the same reaction in the classroom, saying that for the children, it was as if 10 of their classmates had suddenly died. Okay, this is American children reacting to these kids all of a sudden being gone. So this has devastating effects, right, in our schools when these things happen. So yeah, I mean, I think that we need to be conscious of these things. I think we need to understand them, and the more people understand, the more maybe that people will start to call for changes in our immigration system.
And that maybe we can kind of make more comparisons to things like she was sort of mentioning in history, so that we can kind of create more similarities in our differences.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I agree, yeah. Well, thank you so very much. Thank you for